Hi, my name's Stewart Lynch, and in this next video in my iOS 16 series, where I go through a number of new features added to Swift and SwiftUI in iOS 16, I'm going to show you the new ViewThatFits container. ViewThatFits automatically measures available space and the size of its children and takes the first view that perfectly fits the available space. That's it. It's very simple. What I want to do today is to go over some practical examples to show you what this means and how you might want to use it in your own projects. I love getting your feedback, so tap the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video and leave a comment below. Make sure you subscribe to the video and ring that bell to get notifications of new videos. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. I've created a starter project for this tutorial if you want to work along with me. I'll leave a link in the description. The advantage to having a project is that you will, in the end, have a collection of examples that you can refer to when you are ready to implement ViewThatFits in your own projects. It's a very simple starter project that includes a tab view with 4 example views as tabs in case you want to run the project on your phone or in the simulator. We'll be using the SwiftUI preview though, and we'll be previewing each individual view as we proceed. So let's get started by looking at our first example and get a handle on one of the most common examples of how ViewThatFits has been presented by other content providers. Start by replacing the text view with an H-stack. Inside the H-stack, create a for each loop and have it run from 1 through 2 using self as the ID. This will provide us with an iterator that I'm not going to use, so I can just use an underscore. Inside that for each loop then, create a rectangle and set the frame to be a width and height of 175. As we see in the preview, it displays very well on our iPhone 13 Pro with the 2 views laid out horizontally in the H-stack. In the preview, I can click on the Device Settings button and change the orientation. So let's choose Landscape Left. Looks good here too. But what if we have more rectangles? Let's change the for each loop to go up to 3 and repeat our test. In portrait mode, the rectangles are too wide and they no longer fit within the width of our screen. However, if we change the orientation once more to landscape mode, they display just fine. So how would we handle this? Well, in iOS 16, we have this new ViewThatFits that allows us to choose a different view entirely if it doesn't fit within the space presented to it, which in this case is the parent view's width while in portrait mode. No problem though in landscape. So I only want to fix the case in portrait mode. Well, if we had restricted our phone to portrait mode, it would be simple. We would just change this to a V-stack instead of an H-stack. Well, it looks fine here, but when I switch to landscape mode, we've got that problem. So I want to be able to provide our users with both a portrait and a landscape mode. Enter ViewThatFits. We want to offer our view a choice and let it decide which one to choose, either a V-stack or an H-stack. So first, let me factor out this for each loop into a view of its own. I don't know, but Xcode used to allow me to change it when I did a refactor like this, but for some reason now it isn't doing it. So I'll need to use a replace to call our extracted view rectangle views. Now I can embed my V-stack in this ViewThatFits container. And I'll duplicate the V-stack but change it to an H-stack. So I'm offering the ViewThatFits 2 choices. So what it'll do is it'll evaluate how much space is available and choose the best one that fits into that space. So when we have 3 rectangles, I see here that in portrait mode we get a V-stack. But when I switch to landscape mode, we get an H-stack. Well, this is great. And as long as I know how many rectangles I'm going to have, it works. But as soon as I go beyond 3, for example, let me change this to 4 rectangles, our layout breaks. So perhaps we need a different approach if we want to have a variable number of views that I'm going to be presenting. So in example 2, I want it to be really flexible in the number of rectangles that I want to add, and I always want to have them in an H stack because I want to have them inside a V stack and perhaps more content below or above them. And the way to handle this is to embed our views inside something that's going to allow us to choose how we want it displayed. So let's create an example where we can use a stepper to increment the number of rectangles on our screen. Let's start by creating a state property that we can call index that will allow us to bind it to a stepper. And then we'll be able to increase that number of rectangles laid out in our views. But let's start with an initial value of 1. Inside the VStack, then replace our comment with a stepper that goes from 1 to 4 and bound to the index as a value. And we can use the stepper value in to get our code completion with those placeholders. For the title, we'll use the string interpolation to display the number of rectangles, followed by the word rectangle, and then I can conditionally add the letter S only if the index is greater than 1. So it'll display 1 rectangle, but 2 rectangles with an S on the end. And that value is bound to the index. And I'm going to set our range from 1 through 12, allowing me to choose from 1 to 12 rectangles to be displayed. Let me change the font to a large title, and I'll add some padding. I now want to create another array of rectangles like we did in the first one, but this time we'll be passing in my index value, so I can increase the number in my for each loop. So I can go back to that first example and copy this rectangle view. And I'll paste it into this view, but I'll have to change the name to rectangle views 2. I'll add a binding to a variable called index, and I'll change the range in the for each loop to go from 1 to index. And I'm also going to adjust the size to be just 150 square. Next then, below our stepper, I'll create an H stack. And within the H stack, I'll have our rectangles views 2 and bind it to our index. Now, as I tap the stepper buttons, the number of rectangles in the H stacks adjusts, but they don't fit after 2. So the traditional solution here is to embed the H stack within a scroll view. And we'll set the horizontal axis to be horizontal. And then I'll add some padding. If we test this now, we get our rectangle up against the left-hand side of the view. And we know that if there were no scroll view, the H stack would have this rectangle centered, which is really what I want. And the other issue is that with a scroll view, I can swipe to scroll even if there's nothing more to scroll to. The advantage, though, is that I can add more rectangles without any issue and scroll to see them. What I'd really like to do is to introduce ViewThatFits that will display my rectangles in an H stack without the scroll view until they no longer fit inside that view, and then switch to the one embedded in a scroll view. Well, this is pretty easy. First, let's remove the H stack container from the rectangle view here and add it to our stack of rectangles directly in the view, the rectangles 2's view. This changes nothing with respect to our view presentation. Now we can use a ViewThatFits and present either just the rectangles views 2, passing in the index binding, or the one embedded within a scroll view. We now see that the initial rectangle must be in an H stack because it's centered. as it is with 2, and there's no scrolling enabled. However, as soon as I go to 3, I now see it's scroll enabled. If you want to make it even more obvious, you can set a different foreground color to each of the rectangle's views, like applying red to the regular H-stack rectangle and blue to those embedded in a scroll view. And if we switch to landscape mode, I can see that I can add up to 4 rectangles within an H-stack, all nicely centered, before it embeds them in a scroll view. Moving on then, let's explore some other possibilities. One really good use of ViewThatFits is to change not the layout direction, but rather the content instead. Let's replace the comment here with a simple button view with a label New Widget. No action, but we'll set the font to a title font and then set the button style to be a bordered prominent style. Now, button views consume only as much space as is required. Often though, the amount of space that our buttons will have will depend on the parent container. So let me demonstrate that by adding a slider above here that's going to allow us to control the amount of space that we want to give our button. We'll create a private state property called width, and it has to be a CG float, and we'll give it an initial value of 200. Next, within our V stack, above our button, I'm going to create a slider control that's going to be bound to that value of width within a range of 60 through 200, allowing me then to go from 200 all the way down to a width of 60. And let's add some padding. I'll then set the frame of our button view to be that width of that bound value. And then to see what that size of that available space is, I'll just add a border after the frame modifier using a primary color. Now, as we adjust the frame using our slider, the button starts to expand vertically as I compress. I don't want that to happen. I could offer it a line limit of 1, but instead, I like to offer it a different view with less text. So when it gets too small, let's offer it the button just with the text new. And we can do that within a ViewThatFits. Now, as I adjust our width, New Widget eventually goes to just new. But even that's not enough. If we get too small, we now get this expanded vertical again. So let's add a third choice. But this time I'm just going to use a button that uses a system image as a label. And I'll use plus.circle.fill. Now, as I test and move to the left, it goes from the full new widget down to new, and eventually down to just our button with the system image. One thing you should be aware of, though, is that order matters. If we move our new button to be below the button with the system image and test, when we slide to the left, it goes directly from the New Widget button right down to our System Image button, bypassing New. And that's because it will offer up the 3 views, and it'll take the first one that fits. Therefore, we'll never get to the New. And we can do one last thing. We can factor out our entire button, and we can call it New Button View, and we'll be able to use this wherever we want. In our final example, we'll take a look at how text is laid out within a frame that has defined width and height, and how we can use ViewThatFits to manage that. In this example, I provided you with a long string called sample text. If I replace the comment with a text view of that string, it expands horizontally and vertically in the remaining space until all of the text is displayed. Let me add a frame with a width of 240 and a height of 200 around the text, and we'll see that the text gets truncated. Let me also add some padding and set a border of color red with a width of 3 so that I can see what the actual available space is. What I'd like to do is to see how this text grows to fill the space. And to do this, I'll create a slider that will allow me to incrementally increase the amount of text displayed. So I'm going to create two state properties. One that I'll call partial sample, which will be an empty string initially. And then the second one will be a number that's going to represent the number of characters that I want to select from the sample text and put into this partial sample. And I'm going to be using a slider to manage that number of characters. So we'll have to make that number of characters a double and then convert it back to an int when I need it. Above the text field now, create a slider bound to that number of characters in the range that goes from 0 up to the double representation of the sample text count, allowing me then to select from 0 up to the full amount of text. And let me add some padding to that slider. Next, we can add an onChange modifier on our VStack that will monitor the change in the num characters. We won't need this new value, so I can just use an underscore. And then I want to assign to the partial sample the sample text using a prefix of that number of characters. So we'll have to convert that double to an int. But this is a subsequence, so in order to assign it to partial sample, we'll have to convert it to a string. And now with that partial sample string being populated, when we adjust the slide, we can replace our text view with the partial sample instead of our full sample text. So with the default value of the num characters being 0, no text is displayed. But as we slide the slider, the amount of text displayed is shown in the preview, and it grows horizontally and vertically within the container until there's no more space, and when it reaches its limit, the string gets truncated. Well, let's play around with that. I don't want to see truncated view. I want to know when I've reached the limit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to embed this inside a ViewThatFits so that when it reaches the end, I'll display another string that simply says too much text instead of that truncated text. Now when you do that and start to adjust the number of characters, we see it quickly jumps to be too much text, meaning it's assigning a line limit of 1. And that's because by default, the view will only expand in the horizontal direction when we use ViewThatFits. What we'll need to do is to specify that the ViewThatFits will be in the vertical direction. We want to allow it to expand in the vertical direction. So for this, we'll need to add a new argument to our ViewThatFits, which is in, and specify the vertical axis. Now it expands vertically until we reach our limit, and as soon as we do, we get that shortened text. Now you could get pretty creative here in how you want to display the text in a different view to show you the full text. And this is what I've come up with, just to keep it simple. Instead of presenting that text view here, I'm going to change that string to a button with a label that says Show Full Text. I'll leave the action alone here for a second. I'll come back to it, but I'm going to apply a button style of bordered prominent. Now when I reach my limit, instead of the text view, I see a button. Now I want to use this to toggle the presentation of a new sheet view to display the full sample text. And I can do this by creating a state property, and I'll call it show text, and initialize it as false. Then I can change the action for my button to simply toggle show text. With that in place, then I can attach a sheet modifier to the VStack, and it'll be bound to that property, and I'll display the full text sample text. And I'll add some padding. Now when I scroll, I get the button presented, and I can tap on the button, and it'll present a modal sheet showing me the full sample text. Let me quickly then just introduce you to one new feature in iOS 16, and that is presentation detents. And I have an entire video on this new presentation detents and bottom sheets modifier for modal sheets, and I encourage you to watch that video. I'll leave a link in the description. So to do this, I'll add a presentation detent modifier, and it requires a set, and I only want a single medium value. But I'll also set the presentation drag indicator to be visible. Now when I reach the breaking point, the text changes to present that button, which I can tap on, and instead of displaying a full sheet, it displays a sheet that pops up from the bottom, but it comes up approximately only halfway, which is enough to show my full text. Okay, well that's enough for this new container type, and I hope I've given you some ideas on how you might want to use this in your own projects to adjust your views accordingly based on the dimensions of the container view made available to your views. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and leave me a comment. Make sure you subscribe to my channel and ring the bell to enable notifications so that you'll learn about all my new videos as I post them. Thanks for watching.